Gunboats of World War introduction. It was official the age of the gunboat had passed. In December 1904, with a few strokes of his pen, the First Sea Lord Sir John Jacky Fisher decreed that Royal Navy would scrap most of its large fleet of gunboats. It was a force he felt had become obsolete following the launch of HMS Dreadnought. And able to protect themselves in this new age of steel, speed and firepower, these floating relics of a bygone era had become little more than a liability. As Fisher put it, these vessels were too weak to fight and too slow to run. Collectively called them a miser's hoard of junk. Under Fisher, over 90 warships were disposed of, and the money and manpower spent on maintaining these vessels was diverted into the building and manning of new dreadnought battleships. The signal was clear: the Victorian fleet was no longer fit for purpose, and the modern Royal Navy would be leaner, fitter and far more powerful. Despite this call, the gunboat survived, and continued to play an important naval role during the years leading up to the outbreak of World War I. Just about every major naval power of the period had a few of them, and several other navies too. While Admiral Fisher was probably right when he argued that these vessels had become a liability, a few of them were still needed to protect national interests in far-flung corners of the world, to show the flag and to deter would-be aggressors, from local pirates to other rival powers. These gunboats came in a wide variety of types, from masted steam sloops to small river gunboats. They were joined by other strange craft, the small monitors, whose large guns set them apart, even though they often performed an identical role to more conventional gunboats. This eclectic group of small warships may have been a relic of a bygone age, but in the right circumstances they were still powerful enough to make a difference. In August 1914, many of these gunboats found themselves thrust into a war they were ill-prepared to fight. In the waters of the Caribbean, the Indian Ocean, and the Mediterranean, these small gunboats played a forgotten part in these opening months of war. Others took part in more sustained campings, particularly on rivers like the Danube and the Tigris, which snaked through regions split apart by war. Elsewhere, as far afield as Central Africa, northern Russia, and the Aegean Sea, gunboats did what they could to influence the course of the war. While these little gunboats were small, vulnerable and often poorly armed, they were able to operate where more conventional warships were unable to venture, and could exert a considerable influence in the campaigns they participated in. Put more simply, these little gunboats punched above their weight. This, then, is their story, design, and development. The term gunboat has meant different things at different times. During the age of sail, it was a small oared or sail-powered craft, usually little bigger than a large ship's longboat. These vessels usually carried a single large gun in the bow, although larger gunboats were better armed, and could venture farther from shore. Typically these operated from friendly ports, and would venture to attack enemy warships, particularly when they were becalmed or vulnerable because of damage they had suffered. For instance, in October 1808 the 64 gunship of the line HMS Africa was attacked off Malmo by a flotilla of Danish gunboats. The lack of wind gave the gunboats an immense advantage, and Africa would have struck her colors had she not been saved by the lack of daylight. Instead she limped away to safety during the night. A diorama showing the action in the Royal Danish Naval Museum reveals the tactics these gunboat commanders used, clustering themselves off the sailing warships' bow and stern, where they were safe from Africa's powerful broadsides. This was the kind of gunboat that remained in widespread use until the mid-19th century. Then the development of steam propulsion offered new possibilities, and ushered in a new and far more effective form of warship. During the 1840s, 3 prototype gunboats were built for the Royal Navy and put through their paces. Their original role was to attack enemy naval bases, staying away from the main channels, and attacking them from shallow waters, which were uncovered by defensive gun batteries. The designers had the French port of Cherbourg in mind when these vessels were first designed, but instead the craft would have their baptism of fire in the Baltic and Black Seas, rather than off the French coast. During the Crimean War 1854-57, the marriage of a new generation of large long-range guns and these experimental screw-propelled gunboats led to the creation of the first purpose-built steam-powered gunboats. The first of these small craft entered service in 1854, and when these Arrow-class vessels proved too large for coastal operations, they were followed by eventual draft craft. These little warships were used with great success in littoral waters off the Finnish coast and in the shallow Sea of Azov. The bombardment of Kinburn in the Black Sea and Sveaborg in the Baltic would not have been possible were it not for these new shallow-draughted vessels. Typical of these Crimean War gunboats was the Jasper, a dapper-class wooden-hulled gunboat of 284 tons when fully armed and laden, with the ability to float in just 6.5 feet of water. Jasper arrived in the Sea of Azov in the summer of 1855 and busied herself attacking Russian shipping, landing men to raid coastal villages or food stores and taking part in the siege off Taganrog. She ran aground on the 24th of July, thereby ending a brief but eventful career. She had only been launched in April. Like most of her sisters, Jasper carried two Lancaster-pattern smoothbore guns, a 32 PDR and a 68 PDR, the second and third heaviest guns used by the Royal Navy at the time. They were carried on the center line behind the mainmast, and could both fire out onto either beam. Jasper and her numerous sister ships formed part of a brand new gunboat fleet. The 12 British gunboats launched in 1854 were followed by 46 the following year, and an amazing 124 vessels in 1856. The end of the war meant an end in demand, and so only 8 more gunboats were launched during the rest of the decade. More importantly, when the war ended, the Royal Navy had to find a use for this new fleet of miniature warships. That was when gunboats began to embrace the role that they would excel at for the best part of half a century in providing the naval muscle behind the phrase gunboat diplomacy. These gunboats and the many similar craft that followed them would play an important part in upholding Pax Britannica. This was Great Britain's great age of imperialism, when almost a quarter of the globe was administered or governed by Britain, and her merchant ships dominated maritime trade throughout the globe. The Royal Navy had the job of protecting these sea lanes, and all the other naval tasks that came with the maintenance of empire. These included the suppression of slavery and piracy, the protection of British interests overseas, the maintenance of free trade, and the safeguarding of Britain's overseas possessions. The low running cost of the gunboat, along with its relatively high degree of modern firepower and shallow draft, made it the ideal vessel to fulfill these important roles. Effectively, for half a century, the humble gunboat would become the maritime equivalent of the world's policeman. During the late 1850s, British gunboats were sent to the Far East to play their part in the Second Opium War 1856-60, a conflict fought to open China up to British merchants, and to maintain British control of the opium trade. The first gunboats arrived in Hong Kong in 1857, and for the next 3 years they proved their worth, destroying Chinese war junks, supporting land operations, and bombarding enemy positions, such as the Taku forts protecting the seaborne approaches to Peking, Beijing. The gunboats used in China during this period were the veterans of the Crimean War. However, by the end of the decade, a new breed of gunboat began to enter service, vessels designed specifically for this new role as guardian of Pax Britannica. The Philomele-class gunboats produced from 1859 to 67, together with the Cormorant and Britomart classes, represented a new departure. For a start, they were slightly larger than their Crimean predecessors, even though the Britomart class were described as improved dappers, and the Philomeles were based on the larger Algerian-class gunboats of the Crimean War. The Cormorant class, though, were bigger, the idea being that they could carry double the armament of smaller gunboats, and a larger and more impressive L. They were originally armed with 268 PDRS and 232 PDRS apiece, although their suite of weaponry changed slightly during their working lives. Half a world away in North America, another navy had been building gunboats in large numbers. During the American Civil War 1861-65, the U.S. Navy built or converted a large number of steam-powered seagoing warships, which it used to enforce the blockade of Confederate ports, or to hunt down Confederate raiders on the high seas. The term gunboat was often applied as a collective term to cover this disparate collection of warships, as their armament and role was similar to that of their British counterparts. More intriguing, though, was the development of river gunboats, designed to operate on the Mississippi River and its tributaries. Most of these vessels were powered by paddle wheels rather than screw propellers, a means of propulsion that was more practical in the confined and often difficult waters of these great rivers. While the use of river gunboats didn't outlast the war, the notion of gunboats that were purpose-built for use on rivers was one that would soon be resurrected. In both Europe and the Americas, the age of the ironclad had arrived, ushered in by the French La Gloire 1859, the British Warrior 1860 and the U.S. Monitor 1861. While the leading maritime powers began building ironclad capital ships, at first this development had little impact on the lowly gunboat, or for that matter on the new class of cruiser, designed to protect or patrol the sea lanes. However, iron increasingly became the material of choice when it came to building the hulls of a new generation of Victorian gunboats. This was a period of great transition in naval ship construction, armament and function, and after overcoming its conservative nature, the British Admiralty began to recognize the value of iron hulls when it came to gunboats designed for overseas service. They were cheaper to maintain, immune to the ravages of shipworms, and most important of all, cheap to build. In fact, the Admiralty did experiment with armored gunboats. The Vixen class, laid down in 1864, was an attempt to combine the lines of a classic gunboat with the protection of an ironclad. They were found to be too slow and unseaworthy to function properly, and they were eventually towed over to Bermuda, where they ended their days as harbor tenders. Thus, their design contained a number of innovations. They were the first British gunboats to use a compound iron and wood construction, with timber hulls built over iron frames. This set the standard for the gunboats that followed them. One of them also used a form of water jet propulsion, an idea ahead of its time, which proved as ingenious as it was impractical. Just as innovative were the flat iron gunboats produced during the early 1870s, the result of a dead end in naval tactical doctrine. These were coastal gunboats, designed to operate in the English Channel, and whose strange appearance earned them their collective flat iron nickname. Two prototypes were built before the class of coastal gunboats were commissioned in 1870. These ludicrous-looking little craft were the forerunners of the light monitors of World War I, and were armed with a 10-inch muzzle-loading gun that seemed far too large for the small hull that carried it. Despite their impractical appearance, several of these gunboats survived as gunnery training vessels and were still in service in 1914. They were duly refurbished and sent across the Channel to bombard the German-occupied coast off Belgium. This, strangely enough, makes them the oldest active gunboats to the service during World War I. By the mid-1870s, the design of the late Victorian gunboat had been established. Although each subsequent class represented a minor variant on vessels that preceded it, they all shared certain shared characteristics. These gunboats were ocean-going craft, and were usually fitted with 3 masts, although the emphasis on sail power as a means of augmenting steam propulsion was gradually falling into abeyance. A small battery of powerful guns was usually carried along the center line of these vessels, which was capable of being fired out over either beam. Engines became increasingly more powerful, but most gunboats remained single-screwed ships, with a relatively slow speed of 10 to 14 knots. Like Vixen and her consorts, they had composite hulls, with iron frames and wooden hull planking, although a few steel-hulled vessels were built from the mid-1880s onward. These craft, the Royal Navy's gunboats of the last decades of the Victorian era, were the ultimate tools of gunboat diplomacy, and served all over the globe, wherever Great Britain required a naval presence. The world, though, was a changing place. Since 1815, Britain had enjoyed an unquestioned naval mastery, and her ships dominated global trade. From the 1880s, though, rival powers began to flex their own imperial muscles and establish overseas colonies. This coincided with an increase in the naval strength of several hitherto minor maritime powers such as the United States, Germany, and France. While Pax Britannica would continue until the outbreak of World War I, other maritime powers began building their own gunboats and deployed them to protect their overseas interests. While these rival maritime powers remained at peace with each other, this increase in naval power posed no problem, but if a European war began, then these gunboats would become enemies. This increasingly likely prospect played a major part in Admiral Fisher's decision to reduce the size of Britain's gunboat fleet. From that point on, the British gunboats that remained in service had to continue protecting British interests overseas and to police the oceans, but they and their crews also had to prepare themselves for a global war fought against one or more of Britain's European neighbors. Pre-war gunboats in 1860, the Royal Navy had around 200 steam-powered gunboats in service, a few of which were powered by paddle wheel. In 1906, after Admiral Fisher's reduction of Britain's gunboat fleet, just 54 of them remained in service. This included 14 Ant-class flat-iron gunboats and Plucky, a flat-iron prototype, all of which had long since stopped being used in a gunboat role. 6 of these would be disposed of before the outbreak of war. Of the remaining 39 vessels, 8 more would be sold out of service before 1910, while another would capsize when alongside in Hong Kong during a typhoon. That left just 30 gunboats, of which only 10 remained on the active list in 1914. The rest had been reassigned as supply or survey ships, harbor vessels, or tenders. A few of those would be brought back into active service after the outbreak of war, but this didn't change the general picture. There were very few classic gunboats still remaining in the Royal Navy by the time the war broke out in August 1914. The remaining 10 active gunboats comprised 3 different classes of vessel. For Bramble, Britomart, Thistle and Dwarf were Bramble-class gunboats built during the 1890s, but despite their age they were still perfectly capable of policing Britain's overseas empire, a role they had been specifically designed to perform. Of a similar vintage were the 2 Alert-class gunboats Sollert and Torch, which served in the Middle East and the South Pacific. 4 more modern gunboats Cadmus, Clio, Aspiegel and Odin formed the Cadmus class, the last group of gunboats to enter service before Fisher's cuts. All of them had been laid down between 1900 and 1902, and they were expected to remain in service until the 1920s. This small collection of gunboats was all that remained of what had once been the most numerous type of warship in the Royal Navy. Soon they would be called upon to participate in a global conflict for which they were ill-prepared. In truth, the gunboat had been overtaken by events. Britain's global domination of maritime trade was now under threat from other nations, particularly the United States. And by the start of the 20th century other powers had begun to establish new overseas colonies, and therefore needed their own warships to protect their colonial interests. That meant they needed gunboats, many of which were more modern than Victorian remnants of Britain's own gunboat fleet. For example, in the early 1880s the U.S. Congress decided that they needed to modernize their fleet. The first vessel laid down in 1883 was one the U.S. Navy officially labeled a dispatch vessel, but which took the 11th form of a gunboat. The USS Dolphin entered service in 1885, and for years later she was joined by the first of 3 Yorktown-class gunboats, La Belle patrol gunboats by the U.S. Navy. Of these only the first Yorktown remained in active service in 1914, when she joined Dolphin patrolling in the Caribbean. These formed the start of a growing fleet of U.S. Navy gunboats, built to protect America's interests in the Caribbean and the Far East. After the Spanish-American War 1898, the United States acquired new colonies in the Caribbean and the Pacific, as well as a number of gunboats captured from the Spanish Navy. By 1914, the U.S. Navy had almost twice as many gunboats in active service as the Royal Navy. To be fair, by then the British had re-examined the way they policed their overseas colonies, and a greater emphasis was placed on the use of light cruisers as gunboats on foreign stations. Not only were cruisers more powerful, they were also versatile, and so could be called upon to rejoin the main battle fleet in time of war. The same approach was adopted by Imperial Germany, whose colonies in Africa and China required some form of naval protection. While she built several gunboats during the late 19th century, these were designed to fulfill the old gunboat role of coastal attack and defense, not the policing of overseas colonies. So, older German Avisos dispatch boats were deployed overseas before the first purpose-built German gunboats entered service in 1898. Eventually 6 of these would be built for service in Chinese and African waters. Another important pre-war colonial power was the French Republic. By the end of the Franco-Prussian War 1870-71, the French had a sizable fleet of steam-powered gunboats, but like those in German service, these were coastal craft, designed to protect French ports and to attack enemy fortifications. It was only in the mid-1880s that the first purpose-built gunboats were built to protect French overseas colonies. The Comet class of 5 composite gunboats or vessels similar to their British counterparts were augmented in the late 1890s by more modern steel-hulled Surprise-class vessels. And like their predecessors, these 3 gunboats Surprise, Disady and Zelly were still in service in 1914, serving in the waters around French Indochina, the Caribbean, and the west coast of Africa. They were joined by the Cursain, a larger steel-hulled vessel, which was earmarked for service in the Pacific. To support them, the French also built a small flotilla 12 of river gunboats, designed to parade on the rivers and coastal waters of French Indochina and China. Several of these were still in service when the war began, but none of them played a significant role in the conflict. Slightly more unusual were the small gunboats built for service on French rivers and canals. These were designed by the Navy, but served with the French Army, acting as mobile gun batteries on the Western Front. Many other navies maintained gunboats in the years leading up to the outbreak of war in 1914. Essentially, these can be divided into the three main groups mentioned above: ocean-going gunboats built to serve overseas, local defense craft charged with protecting the coast, and river gunboats whose main task was to support land operations. Strangely, as the need for the first category was declining, with cruisers taking on the role of colonial protection, the design of gunboats used in the other two categories was changing too, to reflect new developments in naval ordnance. Essentially, this led to a degree of crossover between these two last categories, when the light monitor fulfilled both of these roles. Similarly, a new breed of river gunboat appeared shortly before or during the war, and although these were usually designed for a particular purpose, like the French river gunboats of Indochina, wartime necessity meant that they were also called upon to serve in other theaters. Another category of gunboats weren't really gunboats at all. The use of auxiliary warships had long been considered a viable way of augmenting the wartime cruiser fleet. This involved the arming of civilian steamers, passenger liners, fishing vessels, or even yachts and launches, and pressing them into service as makeshift gunboats. The Imperial Germany Navy was particularly fond of this notion, and in time of war they planned to use vessels of this kind as commerce raiders. When World War I began, the Germans deployed several of these auxiliary cruisers, ranging in size from the passenger liner Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse to the sailing ship Siedler. Essentially, though, these were commerce raiders rather than gunboats. However, the same policy led to the arming of civilian vessels for the defense of Germany's colonies in German East Africa, German West Africa, and Tsingtao in China. For instance, on Lake Tanganyika, the German gunboats King Donny, Hadwig van Wisman, and Graf van Gitzen were all converted civilian vessels, and they controlled the lake, serving as a maritime bulwark to the colony of German East Africa, now Tanzania. Incidentally, after being amalgamated into the fictitious German gunboat Hagen Lucy, they found immortality at the climax of the film African Queen. Indeed, the plot owed much to the events surrounding the battle for control of Lake Tanganyika in 1915. Similarly, in August 1914, a handful of small civilian vessels were pressed into service as makeshift gunboats for the defense of German West Africa. These included the former revenue cutter Nachtigall and the armed yacht Herzogenaelizaeth, both of which were sunk by the gunboat HMS Dwarf when defending the port of Douala. 13. Monitors and river gunboats. Development of the monitor during the late 19th and early 20th century was not really a new phenomenon. These strange warships had a legacy that stretched back to the bomb vessels of the Age of Fighting. Sail. However, their more direct ancestor was the USS Monitor, built in 1861 to counter the Confederate ironclad USS Virginia. Effectively, a new ship type was created, which would evolve into a variant of the gunboat, designed for a specific kind-of mission. Originally, these vessels were used for coastal defense, as their low freeboard made them unsuitable for deep-water operations. During the last decades of the 19th century, breastwork monitors were produced, with a slightly higher freeboard. The idea was that these could be used to attack classes of 2 monitors apiece. The last of them entered service shortly before the commencement of hostilities against Serbia in 1914. The river monitors were similar to contemporary river gunboats. The only thing that set them apart was the size of their armament. This, though, was about to change. The Royal Navy had built a number of river gunboats for service on the Yangtze and its tributaries, and during the war 2 new classes were produced, ostensibly for service in China, but which never reached the Far East until the end of hostilities. Instead, they proved invaluable in the campaign in Mesopotamia, and were also employed off the Belgian coast and in the rivers of northern Russia. The first of these were simply dubbed China gunboats, but by the time the first of them entered service in 1915, they were known as Fly-class river gunboats. A total of 16 were built, and their main armament, a 4-inch quick-firing gun, was used to pound Turkish positions during the campaign up the river Tigris. At the same time, another 12 large China gunboats were ordered, which evolved into the Insect class. These river gunboats carried to 6-inch guns, and performed well during the campaign in Mesopotamia. Interestingly, that made them every bit as powerful as the light monitors, which entered British service around the same time. The definitions of the two ship types had now overlapped so much that large gunboats and small monitors were virtually interchangeable in the fortresses, the initial role of the steam gunboat. Then the idea developed that monitors could be used to support land operations, firing their guns to assist troops on the shore, either from the bank of a river or the open sea. This became the genesis of a new breed of monitors vessels that were gunboats in all but name. It was the Austro-Hungarians who pioneered the use of monitors of this kind in 1871, when they built a pair of river monitors based on the design of Union monitors of previous decade. Moros and Leda carried a pair of 6-inch guns, but these were found to be too heavy and were replaced by 4.7-inch pieces in the 1890s. These were specifically designed for operation on the river Danube, and formed the basis of what would become the Austro-Hungarian Empire's Danube Flotilla. By 1914, this flotilla had grown to 8 monitors, in 4. SMS Cross, designed by Austrian naval architect Joseph Thiel, SMS Kurs and her sister ship SMS Shamos were intended to guarantee Austro-Hungarian control of the river Danube in the event of a war in the Balkans. The first Austrian monitors to enter service for 2 decades, they were commissioned in 1893–94 and were based at Novi Sad, beneath the Petrovaradin fortress, described as the Habsburg Gibraltar. Kurs was built to engage enemy shore batteries, and her 5 cm belt and 7.5 seam turret armor was designed to withstand direct hits from most contemporary field guns. During the 1914–18 war, though, Kurs was badly damaged twice during duels with shore batteries. SMS Bodrog. In 1903–4, 2 Austro-Hungarian Thames-class river monitors were built in the Danubius riverside shipyard in Budapest. Essentially, they were improved versions of the earlier Kurs-class monitors, which were then 10 years old. The Austrians maintained a rolling program of building a pair of new river monitors every 10 years. However, Bodrog and her sister ship Thames carried their main 12 cm guns into single turrets abreast of the bridge, which meant the craft could remain bows-on to the enemy when engaging them, thereby minimizing the exposure of their hull. An unshielded 12 cm gun aft was added to increase these vessels' ability to engage in indirect fire. Bodrog had the dubious honor of firing the opening shots of World War I. First of these new monitors to enter service were actually river monitors, similar to those used on the Danube. 3 of them were commissioned by the Brazilian government and built in Britain. By then the Brazilians were unable to pay for them, so the 3 vessels were bought by the Admiralty shortly before the outbreak of war. They became the Humber class, and were armed with 2 6-inch guns, mounted in a twin turret. These little monitors were found to be poorly suited to the open sea, but they proved useful enough to keep in service. So, as well as commissioning a wartime series of large gunboats mounting battleship-sized guns, the British also considered building a class of smaller monitors, to be used in support of planned amphibious landings on the German coast. While these plans never reached fruition, the M-class small monitors built to support the operation began to enter service during the summer and autumn of 1915. The first M-class monitors carried a single 9.2-inch gun, taken from old cruisers. Despite the size of their main gun, these monitors had a draft of just 6 feet, making them ideal for inshore operations or for service on rivers. Some of these guns were replaced by lighter 6-inch and 7.5-inch pieces, and a second batch of monitors M29 to M33 were designed to carry to 6-inch guns, mounted fore and aft. Like the Insect-class gunboats being built at the same time, these vessels saw service off the Belgian coast and at Gallipoli, off the river Rufiji in East Africa and on the river Tigris, where they fought alongside Fly and Insect-class gunboats. So, while the Royal Navy began through with a shortage of conventional gunboats, by the end of 1915 larger numbers of well-armed small monitors and river gunboats had entered service, and were proving their effectiveness in Mesopotamia. Other navies also built river gunboats and small monitors. The U.S. Navy maintained a force of 6 monitors, most of which were maintained in reserve, although 2 of Monadnock and Monterey saw service in Chinese waters before and during the war. The U.S. Navy also built a pair of new river gunboats for service on the Yanks. Finally, 4 Arkansas-class monitors entered service in 1923 and were earmarked for harbor defense, although by 1914 all of them had been relegated to other duties, such as serving as submarine tenders. Imperial Germany commissioned the River 17 gunboat Otter in 1909, and she spent most of her brief career based in Tsingtao. She was interned by Chinese following the outbreak of war. Similarly, the Imperial Japanese Navy maintained a small force of gunboats for service in Chinese waters. The Imperial Russian Navy maintained a small force of gunboats in the Baltic, the Black Sea and the Far East. And in 1909 a pair of gunboats were built for service on the Caspian Sea. More interestingly, they also built several classes of armored river gunboats, 8 of the Shkval class, and 7 of the smaller Kalmyk class. The Shkval class gunboats carried a pair of 6-inch guns, mounted in a twin turret, while the Kamyks mounted a pair of single 4.7-inch guns. They were designed for service on the River Amur, which divides Russia from China. All of these were decommissioned in 1914 to release crew from more important elements of the fleet. They were subsequently brought back into service in the new Soviet Navy. Some of the world's smaller navies also employed small monitors, including Sweden and Brazil, while other colonial powers, the Netherlands, Portugal and Spain, maintained small flotillas of coastal or river gunboats to defend their overseas interests, as did China, Greece and Turkey. None of these played an active part in World War I. So, the term gunboat is one that embraces a number of different types of warship. The seagoing gunboats employed by the Royal Navy, the U.S. Navy, Imperial Germany and others were vessels that were maintained to carry out the task of protecting national interests overseas, and were capable of being sent to potential trouble spots if the situation demanded. Next came the smaller group of coastal gunboats, whose range and armament was often limited, and whose main role was either the protection of harbors, or serving as patrol boats in coastal waters. Due to their role, these vessels weren't destined to play a significant part in the war. River gunboats came in a range of sizes and had widely varying capabilities, but the largest of these would provide invaluable support in military campings. Other river vessels used to patrol borders or colonial rivers, saw little or no active service during the conflict. Slightly more significant were the handful of makeshift gunboats converted from civilian craft in order to protect exposed overseas possessions. Finally, there were the light monitors, designed to fire in support of troops ashore, or to bombard enemy strongholds. Some of these were seagoing warships, while others were river monitors, but both shared the same characteristics of a heavy armament and a shallow draft, which meant they could venture into waters that were beyond the reach of more conventional vessels. Despite this range of gunboat types, they all shared one of two basic functions, and in some cases the roles overlapped. These were the defense of national possessions, usually overseas colonies and outposts, and the bombardment of shore targets in support of land operations fought close to rivers or coastal waters. Gunboats were warships that punched above their weight, making their presence felt in remote theaters of war, and performing tasks that other larger vessels were unable to. Collectively, they played a valuable yet largely unsung part in the unfolding drama of the war to end all wars. Without them, the final outcome might not have been altered, but the war might have taken a decidedly different course. Combat potential. The sheer range of gunboats of this period makes it hard to quantify their collective fighting abilities. However, by looking at the gunboats that played an active part in the war, and examining their weaponry, we can understand more about how effective they were in doing their job. For the most part, the largest guns carried in World War I gunboats were 4-6 and 10 to 15 centimeters weapons. These were usually supported by a range of lighter weapons: 12 PDRS 76 mm, 6 PDRS 57 mm, 3 PDRS 47 mm, 2 PDRS 40 mm, and machine guns. While these smaller weapons were largely provided for vessel defense or anti-aircraft protection, the larger guns constituted these gunboats' real offensive weapons capable of pounding enemy positions ashore. Main armament: the British Cadmus-class gunboats carried a 4-inch 40 QF Mark III gun, the F standing for quick firing. These were breech-loading weapons and weighed 1.3 tons apiece. Cadmus-class gunboats carried 6 of these guns and paired mountings fore, aft and amidships, so that 3 guns could fire on each broadside. Gunboats of the Bramble class carried 2 of these weapons, mounted fore and aft of the superstructure, on the vessel's center line. They were all protected by gun shields, which effectively formed open-back turrets. These 4 and 10.2 centimeters guns had a range of 7,700 yards, 7,000 meters, and fired a high-explosive shell. The same type of gun was mounted on the foredeck of British Fly-class river gunboats. This meant they had a range of around 4.3 land miles when firing in support of troops, or 3.85 nautical miles when engaging targets afloat or on shore. These British guns were broadly comparable to the German 10.5 centimeters 4.1 in gun carried in the Iltis-class gunboat, or on the improvised gunboat Graf von Gitzen operating on Lake Tanganyika. The main difference was that the German gun had a greater range, 13,340 yards or 12,200 meters, and the ocean-going gunboats were supplied with armor-piercing as well as high-explosive shells. The 4-inch 40 gun mounted on many U.S. Navy gunboats was a similar weapon, with a range of 11,500 yards 10,520 meters and a choice of both types of ammunition. All of these guns, British, German or American, had a rate of fire of approximately 8 rounds per minute. Of course, monitors were characterized by their large guns. Those carried in Austro-Hungarian vessels were relatively small, 4.7 inches 12 centimeters, I-50 Skoda guns. Range was limited due to the constrained elevation of the Skoda turrets fitted to these monitors, but 14,000 yards 13,176 meters was attainable. With a rate of fire of 10 to 12 rounds a minute, a shell weight of 45 pounds 20 kilograms, and a range of armor-piercing, semi-armor-piercing, high-explosive and shrapnel rounds. This gun was well suited to its role of fire support. This, though, was a relatively light weapon compared to the 6 inches 15 centimeters guns carried on the smallest British M-class and Humber-class monitors, as well as Insect-class river gunboats. Although bore and caliber remained the same, different types of vessels carried different variants and calibers of these guns. Monitors M29 to M33 carried a pair of Mark 12 45-6 guns, while 20 strangely their counterparts of the Humber class carried a mixture of 50 calibre weapons, a Mark ship barrel on the right, and a Mark 15 on left. These were guns that were initially designed for the Brazilian Navy. The Humber class had a limited range, thanks to the limited elevation of their guns. Their maximum range was just 14,130 yards 12,920 meters at an elevation of 15 degrees. The more versatile Mark 12 mounting on Thelader M-class monitors gave these 6-inch guns an impressive range of 23,770 yards 21,735 meters at 30 degrees of elevation. This meant they could hit jets up to 13.5 miles inland. Typically they carried 125 standard shells, as well as 125 high-explosive and 25 shrapnel rounds. This made these monitors extremely potent floating gun batteries. The Insect-class gunboats mounted older Mark I or Mark II versions of the 6-40 gun. These had a far more limited range of just 10,000 yards 9,140 meters at 15 degrees of elevation, firing common and high-explosive shells. However, the simpler mechanism of these older gun mountings meant that the Insect-class monitors could fire an average of 6 rounds a minute, as opposed to 4 from the 6-inch monitors. The 6-inch 30 guns carried by the larger U.S. gunboats such as Dolphin and Yorktown were very similar to these British guns in terms of rotor and mechanism, but superior mountings and a greater freedom of elevation gave them a greater range around 18.0 yards 16,460 meters. A few of Britain's small monitors had even larger guns. The first 14 of the 19 M-class monitors to enter service were designed to carry obsolete 9.2 inches 23.4 centimeters guns, culled from Edgar-class protected cruisers, which were refitted with 6-inch guns. These, plus a few spares held for the Drake and Cressy classes. The last pair of Austro-Hungarian river monitors to enter service before the war began were WWI-class vessels and in. Both monitors were commissioned in 1914, having been built in Linz. This time their main 12 centimeters guns were mounted in a twin turret installed on the foredeck, with a single 12 centimeters turret located aft, on the quarterdeck. This gave them a powerful broadside capability, while matching the ability of the Thames class to fire forward over the bow. Ents participated in the bombardment of Belgrade in October 1915, but was badly battered during the exchange of fire. She went on to serve in the Austro-Hungarian campaign against Romania. SMS Graf von Gitzen, named after the former governor of German East Africa. Graf von Gitzen was built in Germany in 1913 and transported in pieces to Lake Tanganyika, which formed the western boundary of the German colony. There she was reassembled at Kigoma and was launched on the lake in February 1915. Although she was originally designed as a lake freighter, she now found herself serving as an auxiliary gunboat. She was fitted with a 10.5 centimeters gun taken from the German cruiser Königsberg, and served as the flagship of the German flotilla that dominated the lake for a year, until the sinking or capture of two smaller German gunboats by a pair of British motor launches. In June 1916, Graf von Gitzen was damaged in an air attack by Belgian floatplanes, and she was scuttled 6 weeks later, when Kigoma was about to be captured by Allied troops. The gunboat was subsequently raised, and she remains afloat today, serving as the passenger ferry MV Limbauf armored cruiser, provided the main armament of the first batch of FM-class monitors, with each vessel carrying a single 9.2-inch gun. However, the guns from the Edgar-class vessels were less powerful than the stockpiled for the armored cruisers. So, while the newer Mark 10 guns had a range of 25,700 yards 23,500 meters, the older lower-velocity Mark 6 pieces only managed a maximum range of 16,664 yards 15,240 meters. The trouble was, these guns weighed between 22 and 28 tons, the modern guns being heavier, and due to the resultantly high center of gravity of the monitors, they proved to be unstable gun platforms in any kind of swell. So, in 1915 M24 and M25 were given 7.5 inches 50 guns instead, taken from a Swiftsure-class pre-dreadnought battleship. Similar 7.5-inch guns were fitted to M21 and M25 before they entered service. These guns had a maximum range of 14,328 yards 13,100 meters. As no more of these guns were available, M26 and M27 received 6 and 40 guns, similar to those provided for Insect-class gunboats. So, of the first batch of M-class monitors to enter service, M15 to M20, plus M22 and M28 carried their original 9.2-inch guns, M21 and M23 to M25 carried 7.5-inch pieces, while M26 and M27 were fitted with 6-inch guns. All these guns were carried in a single fully enclosed turret mounted on the foredeck. Finally, the second batch of small monitors M29 to M33 all carried to 6-inch guns, mounted in single open-back turrets fore and aft of the superstructure. This second batch proved much more successful than the first group of monitors, in terms of stability, ship handling and accuracy of fire. So, while several of them, together with a few of the 6-inch and 7.5-inch monitors, served as gunboats in the Black Sea, the Aegean, and the White Sea, or after the war in the rivers of northern Russia, the larger 9.2-inch small monitors were not regarded as being versatile enough to function in any other role, apart from as a floating gun battery. It is worth re-emphasizing that with the exception of ocean-going gunboats, the main armament of these little warships was designed for shore bombardment rather than the fighting of surface actions. Despite the term, this involved engaging targets up to full range of the guns, at targets beyond 23 the line of sight of the gunboat. Fire was therefore directed by fire control officers inshore rather than from the bridge off vessel itself. Normally this was carried out by means of radio, linking gunboat's bridge with a naval gunnery support team on shore. But communications could also be undertaken by means of heliograph or signal flags. If available, field telephone lines or spotter aircraft were used to correct the fall of shot. During the attack on the German light cruiser SMS Königsberg on Farivaru Fuji in East Africa, Royal Naval Air Service or NASC planes were used to direct the fire of the light monitors Severn and M.RC. This, though, was still such a new development that before the attack the airmen and gunners had to practice communicating with each other, and to overcome the inherent unreliability of contemporary airborne radio sets. Interestingly, the German cruiser returned fire by means of a fire control officer hidden on the banks of the river close to the British monitors, using a field telephone link. With the exception of the German Iltis class, the British Cadmus class and the American Yorktown or Nashville classes of ocean-going gunboats. In 1914 these vessels lacked the modern range-finding and fire control equipment needed to effectively engage other surface ships. Instead, gunnery within linear of sight was controlled in a more antiquated way using binoculars, compass bearings and the skill of the gun layer. All gunboats had some form of spotting position, usually at a masthead, or failing that the bridge was used. A plotting or transmission station behind or below the bridge was used to analyze the range and bearing information gathered, and pass this on to the gun crews. As the war progressed, rangefinders were fitted, and the whole process became slightly more sophisticated, with information repeaters and switchboards being fitted to coordinate the fire of the gunboat's main guns. Smaller weapons continued to function under local fire control. Smaller weapons' very role of the gunboat meant that these vessels often had to range close inshore to carry out their mission, or operate close to enemy-held riverbanks or shorelines. This meant that they had to be able to defend themselves, whether the threat came from hostile shore batteries, enemy troop formations, or hostile insurgents. Most colonial powers had experience dealing with this last threat, particularly the Royal Navy, whose ocean-going gunboats had frequently become involved in small actions of this kind while fulfilling their role as imperial policemen. What wasn't really expected of them was to have tone-gauge other small warships, although after the outbreak of war this became a real possibility, from enemy gunboats, armed merchant ships, torpedo boats, or gun-armed launches. As the war progressed, the possibility of attack from the air became increasingly likely, and so in some cases additional anti-aircraft protection was fitted. The secondary armament of gunboats of this period was as varied as the appearance of the gunboats themselves. Traditionally, Victorian gunboats were armed with small secondary pitches to deter attacks by local insurgents, whether attacking by boat or storming a quayside. This meant that small QF guns ranging from 3 PDRS to 12 PDRS were carried, which could fire high explosive shells, and had a rapid rate of fire of around 12 to 20 rounds a minute. The larger 12 PDRS, the equivalent of 7.6 centimeters or 3 guns, were usually supplied with a range of ammunition, including shrapnel, high explosive, and semi-armor piercing rounds. Most of these mounts could be used for anti-aircraft defense as well as engaging shore targets, if the elevation of the mounting permitted. For instance, the Hotchkiss 6 PDR to point the 5 or 5.7 centimeters was widely used by the world's navies at this time, and while a low-velocity weapon, it proved just as useful as an anti-aircraft gun as it was an effective surface weapon. The 7.5 centimeters Skoda guns mounted in Austro-Hungarian river monitors were equally effective, but lacked the elevation needed to engage aircraft. In Thames class, that task was left to the 3.7 centimeters Skoda gun, an equivalent of a Hotchkiss 3 PDR in terms of range, firepower, and effectiveness. The elegant Hotchkiss 3.7 centimeters revolving cannon used in German gunboats was a different weapon entirely. It was fed by a magazine holding 8 rounds, and was operated by means of a hand crank. It had a rate of fire of 15 aimed rounds a minute, and a range of up to 4,000 yards 3,658 meters. The revolving cannon fired a 1-pound high explosive shell, and was equally effective against enemy torpedo boats or troops on shore. The Maxim Nordenfeldt or Vickers 1 PDR POM nicknamed after the sound it made when fired was a similar weapon, but was belt-fed, and could be used to engage both surface targets and aircraft. It led to the development of a larger 2 PDR pom-pom, which was introduced into British service in 1915, and mounted in the Royal Navy's Fly-class river gunboats. Finally, most gunboats and small monitors of whatever size or shape carried one or more machine guns. For the most part, these were Maxim guns, or Schwarzlose, Colt or Vickers variants. These fired a .303 and 7.7 mm bullet, and were fed by 250-round canvas belts, giving a rate of fire of up to 500 rounds per minute. Like the other light guns carried on gunboats of this period, if properly mounted they could be used to fire at aircraft as well as surface targets. The final weapons system carried on board these gunboats was the sailors themselves. The Victorian era had been one where the use of naval landing parties had become an extension of gunboat diplomacy. While the scope for this kind of warfare was limited, or even unnecessary when operating with troops ashore, gunboats of all nationalities were still equipped with sufficient small arms, and in some cases cutlasses, to be able to send sailors ashore. They were used in traditional gunboat roles of provident protection for national interests or citizens ashore, and in other situations. When the gunboat was moored or berthed alongside a quayside or riverbank, they could provide a shore guard to cover the approaches to the berth. If required, the firepower of these landing parties could be augmented by the landing of machine guns or smaller pieces of ordnance, such as 3 PDR guns. Taken as a whole, ocean-going gunboats were well equipped for the pre-war job they had to do. While this might have proved inadequate in wartime, these vessels were rarely called upon to engage more powerful warships. Instead, their old peacetime role evolved into a wartime one that was little different, and so these warships proved themselves perfectly capable of performing the tasks assigned to them. The same was usually true of river gunboats or small monitors. While they tended to be provided with a wider range 28 of weaponry, this reflected the increased danger of operating close to enemy-controlled shores or riverbanks. When their armament was found wanting, additional ordnance was fitted. For instance, during the war several M-class monitors received a range of additional anti-aircraft weaponry, which reflected the growing risk posed by enemy air attacks. So, as befitted the changing role of gunboats during the war and the range of tasks they were called upon to perform, not only were they usually well enough armed, their powerful main armament made them extremely useful in the theaters in which they fought. Gunboats in action. The effectiveness of gunboats during World War I is best demonstrated by taking a brief look at their performance in action in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. While gunboats had an important role to play elsewhere, for instance while patrolling in the Caribbean or the Far East, it was in these key theaters that they played the greatest role in the conflict. Europe. In August 1914, the German army advanced rapidly through Belgium and reached the coast of the English Channel. In order to slow their advance, British gunboats and monitors were dispatched to the Belgian coast to bombard German troops occupying Ostend. As the Royal Navy lacked light monitors, old Ant-class flat-iron gunboats were brought back into service and sent to silence the German shore batteries being set up around the Belgian port. In particular, the flat-irons were called upon to lay down a curtain of fire to protect Nieuport, which was under attack by overwhelming numbers of German troops. Although the town was lost, the German attacks were eventually stalled thanks to this curtain of heavy fire. Though the 3 Humber-class monitors arrived too late to join in the bombardment, this naval intervention helped secure the seaward flank of the Western Front, a flank that remained largely static until 1918. While the old Ant-class gunboats were returned to harbor service, the new breed of light monitors replaced them, and M24, M25, M26 and M27 became stalwarts of the Dover Patrol. They spent their war operating off the Belgian coast, from the front line to just east of Zeebrugge, engaging enemy shore batteries, firing into harbors and generally harassing the German defenses in the area. By early 1917 they were joined by M21, M22 and M23, which participated in the mass bombardment of Zeebrugge that May. On the far side of Europe, the Austro-Hungarian Danubian Flotilla was also thrust into the fight from the very start of the war. The river Danube ran through the heartland of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but it then continued on through Serbia, Romania and Bulgaria ere it reached the Black Sea. On the 28th of July 1914, when Austria declared war on Serbia, the river became a front line, and the flotilla was thrust into the campaign from the very start. On the 4th of August, Kurs was hit repeatedly while 29 dueling with a Serb gun battery, and a month later Lida was badly damaged and her gunsalance during a similar duel. In October, Thames hit a mine and sank, but was later salvaged and was back in commission by 1917. The Serbs repulsed for large-scale offensives, but the monitors played their part by bombarding the Serbian capital of Belgrade and preventing Serbian counterattacks across River Sava, which entered the Danube just above the city. The monitors continued to dominate the river for several months, until a new offensive was undertaken in the autumn of 1915. Belgrade was captured in early October, and the remnants of the Serb army withdrew southwards, away from the river. The Austrian river monitors had played a vital part in securing this victory. In August 1916, Romania entered the war on the Allied side, and so the Danube flotilla went into action again, supporting Austrian and German drives down the river towards Bucharest. Russian reinforcements and Allied weapons helped stall the offensive, and the fighting reached a stalemate in early 1917. During the Romanian campaign, Kurs was badly damaged again, while in was sunk when she struck a Romanian mine. The monitor was salvaged, but was still not back in service by the time the war came to an end. In December 1917, Austria-Hungary and Germany signed an armistice with Romania, and the flotilla steamed down the Danube to the Black Sea. It continued on to Odessa, which it garrisoned in April 1918. From there it patrolled the rivers Bug and Dnieper, before the war finally came to an end, and the flotilla was recalled to Budapest. It was finally disbanded in November 1918, whereupon its surviving vessels surrendered to the Allies. They were guarded by the British gunboats Aphis and Ladybird, which were sent up the Danube to receive their surrender. Most of these remaining monitors were subsequently handed over to the newly created Yugoslav Navy while this was taking place at Belgrade, thousands of miles to the north. British gunboats and light monitors were converging on northern Russia as part of an Allied move to support the White Army during the Russian Civil War. From June 1918 until March 1920, Allied expeditionary forces battled with the Red Army in the forests to the south of Archangel. Control of Theravers-Vina, Vago, Onega and Yamsa were vital in order to move in this inhospitable region, and so a number of flying and insect-class gunboats and class monitors were sent to Russia to support the Allied troops. M25 sank a small Russian gunboat on her first patrol, while in early 1919 a monitor flotilla consisting of Humber, M27, M31 and M33 battled other Russian gunboats and gun batteries during a drive up the northern Vina. Flight and insect-class gunboats proved their worth to Sakala, and Cricket sank a Bolshevik floating gun battery, and battled enemy mines and gun batteries. Eventually, the collapse of the White forces in the area necessitated retreat. M25 and M27 were cut off by falling river levels and had to be scuttled and abandoned as the Allies withdrew. Glowworm was also badly damaged by an ammunition explosion in the river port of Breznik. So, it was with mixed feelings that the gunboats and monitors returned home, their crews having failed in their mission, but delighted to finally have the chance to bring their long wartime service to an end. After World War I also saw the Bramble-class gunboat HMS Dwarf thrust in Tokshan from the start. In early August 1914 she was in Gibraltar, completing Arafat, when she was ordered to the West African coast. By mid-August she was in Sierra Leone, where a British force was preparing to seize the German West African colonies of Togoland and the Camerons. On the 24th she sailed in company with the cruiser Cumberland, and 4 days later she was off Loam and Togoland. The occupation of the colony had been almost bloodless, and Hergens remained silent. She put into the Nigerian port of Lagos to take on coal, and then continued south to Douala, now Douala in the Camerons, Cameroon and German. On the 4th of September Dwarf and Cumberland dropped anchor in Ambas Bay, but a landing was cancelled as the amphibious force was too disorganized. It went ahead 2 days later, and on the 9th of September Dwarf sailed up the river Cameroon, now the Wari, towards Douala itself. There she encountered the German auxiliary gunboat Herzog Elizabeth, which she hit with a 4-inch shell. The German gunboat limped away, but Dwarf was unable to follow, as blockships, mines and gun batteries protected their river mouth. On the 11th of September she engaged the battery, but withdrew when 31 German shell exploded beneath Dwarf's bridge. Next she thwarted a German attempt to sink the gunboat using the launches filled with homemade bombs. Dwarf's searchlights detected them, and they were driven off. Finally, just before midnight on the 16th of September Dwarf was attacked by the German gunboat Nachtigall. She was illuminated by searchlights and riddled with shot, but Nachtigall still managed to ram into Dwarf before drifting away and blowing up. Douala surrendered 2 weeks later. 7 months later, on the far side of Africa, the light monitors Mercy and Severn entered the Rufiji Delta in an attempt to sink the German light cruiser Königsberg. The German cruiser had been trapped in the Rufiji by British cruisers, but they were unable to pursue her upriver. So the 2 monitors were sent out from Britain, and on the 6th of July 1915 they began their attack, using aircraft to direct their fire. The Germans used a spotter too, as mangrove-lined banks of the twisting river blocked line of sight. Eventually the monitors withdrew after Severn was hit twice. 5 days later they tried again, and managed to silence the cruiser in a gunnery duel that lasted for 5 hours. By its end Königsberg had settled on the bottom of the river and was abandoned, but not before her guns were removed, to be used elsewhere in German East Africa. One of the recipients was the Graf von Gitzen, an auxiliary gunboat that dominated the landlocked waters of Lake Tanganyika. She was a passenger vessel that had been converted into a stately gunboat, and together with her smaller consorts Kingani and Hedwig von Wissmann she protected the western borders of German East Africa. When these vessels started bombarding lakeside settlements in British Rhodesia and the Belgian convoy, it was decided that the Allies needed to do something to regain control of the lake. The eccentric Lieutenant Commander Spicer Simpson was given command of two motor gunboats, which were transported from Britain to South Africa. From there their journey continued by rail, river or by land, dragged across the bush by teams of oxen. They finally reached the shores of Lake Tanganyika in late October 1915. By now Spicer Simpson's little gunboats had been given names, Mimi and Tau, French for Mayo and Beauvoir respectively. They were each armed with a 3-Pter Hotchkiss forward and a Maxim machine gun aft. On the 22nd of December they were launched on the lake, and 2 days later they attacked and captured the Kingani, after her only gun was disabled. She was rearmed with a 12 PDR, renamed Fifi, and added to Spicer Simpson's little squadron. On the 9th of February 1916 it was the turn of the Hedwig von Wissmann, which was attacked by Mimi and Fifi accompanied by a lightly armed Belgian auxiliary. After a running battle, a shell from Fifi hit the German gunboat Sengenrum, and she was scuttled by her crew. Spicer Simpson never got the chance to take on the much larger gunboat Graf von Gitzen. She was damaged by Belgian aircraft, and scuttled on the 26th of July to avoid capture. The Middle East entry of Turkey into the war posed problems for the Allies, as it severed their Black Sea links with Russia. In April 1915 Allied troops landed in Gallipoli in an attempt to force the Dardanelles and the sea approaches to Bosporus and the Black Sea. The campaign soon degenerated into a bloody stalemate, as the Allies suffered heavy casualties and made almost no territorial gains. Monitors of various sizes were dispatched to Gallipoli and 30 to by the summer, 10 batch 1M-class light monitors, all 6 batch 2 variants and the Humber were operating off the peninsula, providing naval bombardment support for the Allied troops. They also shelled Bulgarian relay installations, as part of an unsuccessful attempt to prevent the country siding with the Turks. After the Allied withdrawal from Gallipoli, several of the light monitors served as gunboats, patrolling the Aegean, before some moved on to the coast of Palestine. There they supported the British advance from Egypt by shelling Turkish ports and coastal batteries. In October 1917 M15 was torpedoed and sunk off Gaza, while 2 months later M28 was sunk off the Dardanelles during a sortie by the German battlecruiser Goeben. These, though, were small-scale operations compared to the naval effort designed to support the British campaign against the Turks in Mesopotamia. In November 1914 British troops landed to protect the installations of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company around Abadan and Basra, where the Shatt al-Arab waterway enters the Persian Gulf. The landings were supported by Thegans of the Cadmus-class gunboats Espiegel and Odin. At this stage of the campaign Turkish resistance was minimal. The following summer the British began an advance up the river Tigris towards the Turkish stronghold of Kut. From there the plan was to continue on to Baghdad. The 2 gunboats were joined by their sister ship Clio as they pushed up the river as far as Kut. The town fell, and by November the British had reached Ctesiphon, outside of Baghdad. The Battle of Lake Tanganyika, 1916. On the morning of the 9th of February 1916, Lieutenant Odebrick commanding the small gunboats Hedwig von Wissmann left his nighttime anchorage on the eastern shore of La Tanganyika and set a course towards the small port of Albertville, on the Belgian Congo side of the long narrow lake. At 7:45 a.m. he spotted a launch approaching, accompanied by the even smaller German gunboat SMS Kingani, which was flying a British ensign. Realizing that Kingani had been captured, Odebrick turned away, hoping to lure them up the lake, towards the larger gunboat Graf von Gitzen. The armed motor launch was HMS Mimi, and she and Kingani, now renamed Fifi, immediately gave chase. Mimi kept her distance and began firing at the Wissmann, until Odebrick turned so his larger bow gun could bear on her pursuer. The 2 craft exchanged fire without hitting each other, but this allowed the slower Fifi to catch up and join in the action with her bow-mounted 12 PDR. She hit the German gunboat twice, her last shot piercing Wissmann's boiler. With Wissmann dead in the water, Odebrick ordered the survivors to abandon ship, and then scuttled the gunboat. This plate shows Mimi pursuing the Hedwig von Wissmann as the turning gunboat tries to clear the arc of her bow-mounted 4.7 cm gun. Turkish resistance had strengthened, and a breakthrough proved impossible. Running short of supplies, the British withdrew back to Kut, pursued by a much larger Turkish army. Newly Arab Fly-class gunboats did what they could to support the withdrawal, but Firefly was damaged, abandoned and captured during their retreat. Kut was besieged, and in April 1916 it fell to the Turks. During the several attempts to lift the siege, the Fly-class gunboats provided naval bombardment support to the relief force. However, they were unable to save the garrison. The British regrouped, and a fresh offensive was launched in December. This time the Fly-class gunboats were joined by the first of the larger insect-class vessels. Mantis, Moth and Tarantula, plus Butterfly, Gadfly and Snakefly eventually fought their way upriver to reach Kut. It was recaptured in late February, and the advance on Baghdad began. The insect-class gunboats proved invaluable, preventing the Turks from using the river as an avenue of retreat. On the 11th of March 1917 the British entered Baghdad, led by the 6 gunboats mentioned above, who recaptured Firefly, which had been flying Turkish colors for 16 months. What remained of the Turkish army withdrew to Mosul, and the campaign fizzled out, as the British diverted what troops they could to Palestine. British gunboats played a major part in this campaign, as the river was the only viable avenue into Mesopotamia, and their firepower proved vital in securing control of the waterway. While some of them saw further action off Palestine, the campaign in the Tigris demonstrated just how effective these small gunboats could be. Gunboat specifications. It is impractical to list all of the gunboats of all nations in service during World War I. Instead, this section presents a selection of the more important gunboats and gunboat classes, including those vessels that took an active role in the conflict. Into cases, details are provided for Turkish and British motor launches vessels that were too small to be classed as gunboats, but which are included to complete the picture of the naval forces ranged against gunboats in Lake Tanganyika and the River Tigris. HMS Firefly in action on the Tigris. 1915 The Fly-class gunboat HMS Firefly accompanied the British advance on Baghdad in late 1915, and provided naval bombardment support during the Battle of Siphon the 22nd to the 25th of November, fought just outside Baghdad. Realizing that he lacked the troops and supplies he needed to defeat the Turks, General Townsend decided to withdraw back to Kut. Firefly helped cover the retreat. On the evening of the 30th of November, Lieutenant Edison moored Firefly for the night on the left east bank off the Tigris, close to the army's encampment at Amal Tabil, a locality some 12 miles south of Azizia. Dawn revealed that the Turkish 44th Regiment had arrived during the night, and soon Turkish mountain guns were firing at Firefly and the paddle-wheel tug Comet. They slipped their moorings and fired back, until at 7 o'clock a.m. the order came to withdraw downstream. At that moment a shell hit Firefly's boiler, and she was rendered helpless. Comet tried to tow her to safety, but the tug was hit, the gunboat ran aground, and the attempt had to be abandoned. While Firefly's crew were rescued by another tug, the gunboat had to be left behind. She was soon repaired, rearmed and renamed the Selman Pak by the Turkish Navy. This plate shows Firefly in action, shortly before she received her disabling boiler hit 40 propulsion twin-screwed, steam propulsion 1,450 St. Helena pounds speed 9.5 knots Orman, to 6 inches 50 guns in a single twin turret, to 4.7 in howitzers in single mounts, for 3 PDRS in single mounts, 6 machine guns slayed down all in August 1912 completed November 1913 to February 1914. Complement 85 M-class monitors batch 1 vessels in class 14 M15 to M28. Displacement 650 tons fully laden length 177 feet 3 inches 54 meters beam 31 feet 9.4 meters draft 7 feet to 0.1 meters maximum propulsion 4 screwed. Diesel propulsion 6,400 St. Helena pounds. Speed 11 knots Orman 19.2 and 46 gun in a single turret. 112 PDR, 16 laid down all in March 1915 HMS Sedgefly. The first of the newly commissioned Fly-class river gunboats arrived in Mesopotamia in time to support the initial British advance up the River Tigris towards Baghdad. However, Sedgefly was yet to arrive, being part of the second batch of these gunboats to be built. Like the first batch, these vessels were all built at the Yarrow shipyard on the River Clyde. Sedgefly joined the Tigris Flotilla in late March 1917, after the fall of Baghdad. However, she saw action during operations farther up Tigris and the Euphrates, when British forces advanced on Ramadiya and Mosul, securing the final defeat of the Turkish army in Mesopotamia. This view of Sedgefly shows her with her awnings removed, but with their framework still in place over her superstructure. HMS Mantis, one of the first insect-class gunboats to join the Tigris flotilla, was HMS Mantis, having been towed there from Britain. She first saw action in March 1916, during the second unsuccessful attempt to relieve the beleaguered British garrison at Kut. She fired more naval bombardment missions in support of a third attempt the following month, but once again the Turkish lines held, and Kut fell on the 29th of April. Mantis returned to Kut in February 1917, and her guns played an important part in their capture of the town. The gunboat continued to spearhead the Riverine advance up the Tigris, until Baghdad finally fell to the British on the 8th of March. This view shows her as she looked during this final drive on Kut and Baghdad. HMS M33 Admiral Fisher ordered the building of several classes of large monitors in 1915 to support a planned amphibious landing on the German coast that never materialized. In addition to these monitors mounting battleship-sized guns, the Admiralty also ordered smaller shallow-draughted class monitors to provide fire support as close as possible to the beachhead. While the first batch of these monitors mounted larger guns, the second batch of 6 vessels carried to 6 guns, mounted in a pair of single turrets. The light monitor M33 was built in Belfast, and entered service in the summer of 1915. She saw service off Gallipoli and in the Aegean, before being sent to northern Russia in 1919 to operate on the River Dwina. M33 survived both world wars, and is now preserved as a historic ship, based in Portsmouth. USS Dolphin. Although she was officially described as a dispatch vessel, USS Dolphin was the first ship of the new Navy, and the forerunner of a successful series of American patrol gunboats, which entered service between 1885 and 1900. She also served as a gunboat herself, and saw action during the Spanish-American War 1898. In April 1914, Dolphin was involved in the Tampico affair, when U.S. sailors were arrested by Mexican federals. This led directly to the American occupation of Veracruz. Dolphin resumed her duties as a gunboat, and was present at the U.S. occupation of Santo Domingo in 1916. After the United States' entry into the war, she patrolled the Caribbean until the end of hostilities. This elegant little vessel was a useful advocate of U.S. gunboat diplomacy during her lengthy career. She was finally decommissioned in 1921.